Award-winning ethnic and gender studies scholar Carla Kaplan is currently the Davis Distinguished Professor of American Literature at Northeastern University, where as the founding director of the university's Humanities Center, she created a conversational hub dedicated to diversity. She's also taught at Yale University, the University of Southern California, and the University of Illinois. Professor Kaplan's previous books include Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, the first published collection of a major African-American woman's letters, and The Erotics of Talk, Women's Writing and Feminist Paradigm. She's also been editor of numerous works of African-American literature. Miss Ann in Harlem draws on Professor Kaplan's 30 years as a white scholar in Black studies to explore cultural crossovers. Please join me in welcoming Carla Kaplan to the JCCSF.
Okay, let me start by moving the mic down to my height, and then thanking the JCCSF for having me. I particularly want to thank Stephanie Singer, who I must say has rockin' taste in sterling jewelry. I don't know if you noticed the little separated at birth thing. We didn't plan this. It was just kind of a coincidence. How's the sound? Is this okay? Okay. And I also want to thank Brandon Battaglia and Andy and Ben and Green Apple Books. It's really fun to be here. And thanks to friends and family who are here, which I really appreciate. Let me start with a couple words about the definition of the phrase Miss Ann. Miss Ann is a term which is derisive for any white woman. It's a sort of derisive slang term with a long history, really going back to Southern domestics. Southern Black women who worked in white women's homes could never afford to be disrespectful to or ignore their white female employers. But behind their backs, they could lump them into a category, refer to them as Miss Ann, and dismiss them. And it is the counterpart to a phrase you probably have heard, which is Mr. Charlie or Mr. Eddie. But Miss Ann, unlike Mr. Charlie and Mr. Eddie, has sort of dropped out of the popular awareness, except in Black communities. One of the reasons I use this term in the title is that if you drop the phrase Miss Ann into any room full of Black people, everybody laughs. And until this book came out, if you dropped the phrase Miss Ann into any room full of white people, they would all go, what? Huh? And one of the things that reminded me of is that we still live often in divided worlds, where something can be meaningful to one community and relatively meaningless to another. And that was the division also that almost 100 years ago, Miss Ann faced when she sought to cross worlds and go into Harlem. The women I write about in this book were not, by and large, derided and dismissed categorically as Miss Ann. Indeed, the derisive referencing to white women as Miss Ann was just what they wanted not to be seen as. The women I write about in this book were trying to be something other than Miss Ann in Harlem, but the long image of white women as a problem for Black communities was part of what they faced, along with white racism, which said to them, don't you go there. And if you go there, you cannot come home. So that's all just by way of the title. So here's Miss Ann in Harlem. And for those of you who want an actual identifier, that's Fania Marinoff. When I set out in search of Miss Ann, I found about 6 women who were more than just slummers, who were more than just casual tourists going up into Harlem, which is to say that these were white women who put Harlem at the center of their lives and who centered their own lives on its Renaissance. They were hostesses, editors, activists, philanthropists, patrons, writers, wives, lovers, and mothers. Some were wealthy, and they were looking for a good place to put their money in the arts. Others lost their money because of their political commitments. Some were Jews, not yet considered white at this point in American history. Remember that. Jews were not white in the 1920s, right? But when these white women who were Jews crossed into Harlem, they suddenly became very white indeed. Some were matronly and mature. Others were classic, even iconic new women and flappers. When I set out in search of them, no one had ever put them together as a group before. No one had looked at them seriously. No one had asked them to explain why they crossed social lines which were then seen as impenetrable, what they were seeking, or what their experience of experimenting with identity was like for them. But in their day, they were asked that question all the time. Trinidadian poet Alfred Cruikshank, for example, wrote a poem asking why British heiress Nancy Cunard, there she is with her famous, at the time, Negro anthology. Cruikshank wrote a poem which he published, in which he asked Nancy Cunard why she threw in her lot with black people at the expense of the vast Cunard fortune. This is the Cunard fortune of the shipping line and the cruise ship, which she lost because she refused to renounce or to hide her black lover. Cruikshank wondered why she would do that. His poem included the following lines. "What was it, madame, made you enlist in our sad cause all of your heart and soul?" In answer to Cruikshank, she wrote a poem which she published answering him. "My friend," she wrote, "maybe I was an African one time." And the women I write about in this book, Yankee schoolteacher Lillian E. Wood, Texas heiress Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, Barnard founder and playwright Annie Nathan Meyer, notorious patron Charlotte Osgood Mason, and writer Fannie Hurst, and I think this is a room of people who know who that is. That's not always my good fortune. These women all believed, to varying degrees, that they could and should embrace blackness, that they could and should take responsibility for whiteness and try to be something other than what they were born. In Harlem, they felt that they could do that, and that they even, as Nancy Cunard put it, sometimes could quote, and I'm quoting now from Nancy Cunard, "speak as if I were Negro myself." Now, for us, that's a sort of problematic thing for a white woman to say, right? I speak as if I were Negro myself. One of the things that was most interesting to me in my research in the time about this moment in racial cultural history was how often they were invited by blacks as white women to do exactly that. And part of the odd story of Miss Ann in Harlem, and the surprising story, is the welcome they received for doing something that to us is a little cringeworthy, seems a little outrageous, appropriative, and certainly politically incorrect. So first, I want to give you a sense of where that invitation to speak as if I were Negro myself would have come from, and a little bit of what things were like in Harlem at the time. There's Harlem, just to remind us of the other coast, right? Harlem in the 1920s was Black America's Mecca. The symbol, as Adam Clayton Powell Sr. put it, of liberty and the promised land to Negroes everywhere. Harlem was a place, but even more importantly, Harlem was an ideal and an idea. The idea, after decades of devastating racism, of black self-determination and self-definition. and the idea, entirely novel at the time, of eschewing white values and standards to instead embrace blackness. Harlem was the vibrant embodiment of the brand new notion that black is beautiful. Listen to Harlem Renaissance novelist Nella Larson rhapsodize about what she dubbed the fantastic motley of blacks making up what she called Harlem's moving mosaic. Sooty black, shiny black, taupe, mahogany, bronze, copper, gold, orange, yellow, peach, ivory, white. White always having been a color found for complex historical reasons in black communities. Alain Locke's essay, Enter the New Negro, which anchored his 1925 collection, Harlem, Mecca of the New Negro, put the sense of things at the time this way. The mind of the Negro seems suddenly to have slipped from under the tyranny of social intimidation and to be shaking off the psychology of imitation and implied inferiority. We are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation. The vital inner grip of prejudice has been broken. The Negro today is inevitably moving forward under the control largely of his own objectives. Deep feeling of race is at present the mainspring of Negro life. The pulse of the Negro world has begun to beat in Harlem. Well, no wonder that one of the most common sayings from 125th Street to St. Nicholas, and from the famous, world famous actually, cabarets to the County Cullen branch of the public library was, I'd rather be a lamppost in Harlem than the governor of Georgia. It's good, right? Don't you want to steal it for other things? Most of you would probably be a lamppost in San Francisco than the governor of anything, right? The radical journal, The Messenger, gave a yearly prize for the best essay written by, quote, New York Negroes on why they liked Harlem. The 1927 winner, who lived on 136th Street, wrote that Harlem is black life perfected. Crowds of faces, black, brown, yellow, parading 7th Avenue. Women clad in elegant finery, followed by their less pretentious sisters in gaudy imitations. Workers who pass, returning to Harlem for association with kindred spirits. Writers who enjoy us and write uncensored recollections, rent parties that laugh at the HCL. Now the HCL would mean the Harlem Condo League, but then it meant the Harlem Civic League. Street speakers who enjoy their exhorting, protest and mass meetings that die a-borning. It is life, life, life. We suck its breast and enjoy it. 1920s Harlem was magic. Thanks in part to the proliferation of journals and magazines which the Renaissance generated, and there were hundreds in just a few years alone, and thanks as well to the stories which are carried back and forth across the Great Migration away from the South's Jim Crow, Harlem was a national idea. It was an imagined community for blacks from every corner of the country. In his autobiography, Langston Hughes remembered that, as he put it, I was in love with Harlem long before I got there. Once Hughes did get to Harlem, however, he found a more complex and even vexing place than he'd imagined. The nation's symbol of black self-definition was not only a black Mecca, it was also becoming a white playground. This is an actual map of pleasure, a nightclub map of Harlem, and I don't know if you can see some of the stereotypes it builds on, but they're everywhere in this map. And it was part of an actual industry at the time of tourist maps and guidebooks written for whites who wanted to go slumming in Harlem. Gay and straight, male and female, white would-be revelers descended on Harlem from taxis and subway stations, in spring weather and in snowstorms, individually and by guided tour, in hopes of an evening's dose of the life-giving force they believed in and that popular culture reinforced, and that this map references. One travel writer gushed, "Here is the Montmartre of Manhattan, a great place, a real place, an honest place, and a place that no visitor should even think of missing. But visit Harlem at night, it sleeps by day." Now, wait a minute, right? Of course Harlem doesn't sleep by day. Harlem was filled with people getting up in the morning to their alarm clocks, bustling their kids off to school, making breakfast, getting to work, fighting with the landlord, reading the newspaper. Harlem only slept by day if you saw it as a white playground. Increasingly, this was a source of revenue and also a problem throughout the Harlem Renaissance. As writer, diplomat, and civil rights activist James Weldon Johnson put it, this white enthusiasm was making Harlem the great mecca for the sightseer, the pleasure seeker, the curious, the adventurous. The Crisis, Journal of the NAACP, founded by Du Bois in 1910, went even further, calling Harlem's Renaissance a moral vacation for whites, and calling Harlem a place, as Wallace Thurman put it, for whites to do openly what they only dared to do clandestinely before. Some of the most celebrated Black entertainment venues in Harlem began catering to white dollars at the expense of local Blacks. The famous Cotton Club, for example, had a whites-only policy for its patrons. Langston Hughes wrote, "At almost every Harlem upper-crust dance or party, one would be introduced to various distinguished white celebrities there as guests. It was a period when almost any Harlem Negro of any social importance at all would be likely to say casually, as I was remarking the other day to Haywood, meaning Haywood Braun, or as I said to George, referring to George Gershwin. It was a period when Harold Jackman, a handsome young Harlem school teacher of modest means, calmly announced one day that he was sailing for the Riviera for a fortnight to attend Princess Murat's yachting party. It was a period when Charleston preachers opened up shouting churches as sideshows for white tourists. It was a period when white writers wrote about Negroes more successfully, commercially speaking, than Negroes did about themselves. It was the period, God help us, when Ethel Barrymore appeared in blackface in Scarlet's Sister Mary by white writer Julia Peterkin. It was the period when the Negro was in vogue. Now, it should come as no surprise, right, that Blacks did not, in the main, find this white takeover of their site of self-definition welcome. Harlem Renaissance physician and writer Rudolph Fisher, in his essay, The Caucasian Storms Harlem, asked, "Is this interest akin to that of the Virginians on the veranda of a plantation's big house, sitting genuinely spellbound as they hear the lugubrious strains floating up from the Negro quarters?" Then he went on, "Time was when white people went to Negro cabarets to see how Negroes acted. Now, Negroes go to those same cabarets to see how white people act." All of a sudden, popularity could be quite offensive. This is a close-up of another nightclub map of Harlem, so you get an idea of the kinds of stereotypes this tourist industry openly built on. The idea that Blacks should provide a social safety valve for stifled white passions was especially insulting, as was the pressure to perform a version of Blackness that satisfied white expectations. Ordinary Negroes, Langston Hughes maintained, did not like being observed like amusing animals in a zoo. One Black newspaper called the influx of whites into Harlem a most disgusting thing to see. Eslanda Robeson, Paul Robeson's wife, spoke for many who did not feel comfortable saying so in public, when she insisted that Harlem is a colored community. One knows without being told, she said, that white people, the white person occasionally seen in the streets of Harlem, does not really belong there. Only Negroes belong in Harlem, and they actively resent the presence of white tourists. They dislike being looked over by the au faits. Now, does everybody know what an au fait means? It's a term for white people. Another little piece of black slang you can take out of here, black slang for white people. It is thought, we are actually not sure about this. It is thought that the term au fait, its derivation is Pig Latin for faux. Now it does work, faux, au fait. Whether or not that's true, it's so good that most of us repeat it because, whether or not it really comes from Pig Latin for faux, it's pretty good. But even as Londa Robeson also conceded that some good might come from being observed by whites. This mixing, she wrote, is the best thing that could happen to solve the Negro problem in America. When white people come to know the Negro as he really is, whether or not they decide to like him, become bosom friends with him, or marry him, the single greatest barrier will be broken down. Now, Eslanda Robeson, as many of you do know, had special reasons to resent white women, being married, after all, to a man who was altogether too popular with them. But mixed and contradictory feelings about the interracialism fueling the Renaissance abounded in Harlem. Langston Hughes excoriated the Harlem Vogue, but he was best friends with Harlem's most infamous white man, Carl Van Vechten, about whose Harlem doings he was considered an honorary Negro. And his Harlem doings were so famous, there was even a popular song encouraging like-minded whites to go to Harlem and, get ready for the rhyme, like Van Vechten, go inspectin'. Yeah, it was a very popular song in the day. Walter White, one of the NAACP's most earnest civil rights workers, went out of his way at one of his most important interracial benefits to secure as his headliner a torch singer named Libby Holman. Any of you remember Libby Holman? Getting a few nods. Libby Holman was a famous and stunning torch singer. There were some images of her in the opening loop. But at this moment, Libby Holman was most famous in New York for an exceedingly controversial performance. It was a song called Moanin' Low, in which she performed as a prostitute in brown face, begging her pimp not to leave her. And it was not only extremely controversial, because this is a moment when brown and blackface is very controversial, but the NAACP is the national political organization behind the national boycotts of all brown and blackface performances. And Walter White goes out of his way not only to get Libby Holman, but to get her to perform Moanin' Low in brownface at an interracial NAACP benefit. All of this was part, to borrow a phrase from Michael Dyson, of the ecology of race at the time. And so were conflicting ideas about the very nature of race itself. Some believed that it was an essence, immutable and to be celebrated. Many believed it was what we now call a social construction, a dangerous myth to be decried and deconstructed. Virtually all of Harlem adhered to an idea that race, whatever it was an ethics, an obligation towards those with whom one's lot was cast. Blacks like Walter White, who might have passed, and if you've ever seen pictures of him, he was so white, he was almost translucent. But he had a little drop of black blood, and this is the period of hypodescent where the idea of race is sustained by the notion, which most of us now look at as a crazy notion, that you can count black blood, that you can count the amount of black blood somebody has, and that one drop of black blood made you black. Blacks who might have passed but did not, like Walter White, who insisted, I have drops of black blood, you will call me a black man. You will not call me a white man. They were lionized throughout Harlem as voluntary Negroes, and they were held up as models for the community. Now, that lionization may have given whites, and even some blacks, the idea that they too could and even should volunteer for blackness as an act of empathy and solidarity, as a pioneering proof of identity's mutability and flexibility. The crisis editorialized against whites treating Harlem as a moral vacation, but it also endorsed forms of cross-racial identification through which whites could take a vacation from, maybe even temporarily vacate, their own whiteness. For example, towards the end of the 1920s, the crisis began to transform its poets page, which was standard fare in most newspapers of the day, but it began to turn its poets page into a forum for white views of race. And they were white views of race which often included such attempts to volunteer. I was so fascinated by these white attempts to volunteer for blackness in poetry that I made one of them the frontispiece of the book. I found this one in a 1931 Poets page of the crisis, and I just want to give you a flavor of this. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but I just want to read you a few lines so you get an idea of what some of these attempts to volunteer sounded like. This is called A White Girl's Prayer, and it's by a white poet named Edna Margaret Johnson, and yes, I checked. She was real. She was a real person. I went back into the census records in the directories, and she was white. And this is what she wrote. I writhe in self-contempt, O God. My Nordic flesh is but a curse. O God of life, remove this curse. The cords of shame are strangling me. Remorse is mine. I would atone for white superiority, sheer carnal pride of my own race. Tonight, on bended knees, I pray, free me from my despised flesh, and make me yellow, bronze, or black. Now, some white women went further even than Johnson's expression of white self-hatred and longing for blackness. And those were the women who tried to put Harlem at the center of their lives and to make lives for themselves, to carve out for themselves a place within this volatile and complex ecology of race. It may be hard for some of us to imagine what an unbelievably bold thing this was to do at the time. It was one thing for white men to go slumming in Harlem, where they could enjoy a few hours of exotic dancers and hot jazz and then grab a cab back downtown. But it was another thing altogether for white women to embrace life on West 125th Street. Epitomizing everything that was unrespectable at a time when social respectability meant a great deal more than it does now. A white woman who embraced Harlem risked extraordinary disapproval and even ostracism. In the 1920s, short of becoming a prostitute, there was no surer way for a white woman to invite derision than to eschew her own whiteness or be intimate with a black man. So Miss Ann challenged her era's cherished axioms of racial identity. She pushed the idea that identity is affiliation, allegiance, and desire, rather than biology or blood, further than anyone else, and often actually quite further than she meant to. What I want to do now is turn to the reading portion and read for just 15 minutes or so from one of the chapters in this book. And it is the chapter on Josephine Cogdell Schuyler. There she is. A white Texas heiress, I would say quite a beauty too, who married Harlem's most satirical black writer. Not only did she marry Harlem's most satirical black journalist, George Schuyler, but in her life in Harlem with him, she proceeded to pass in her writing as myriad black women, including, I discovered in my research for this book, passing for years as a really unlikely black woman. Throughout Harlem, there was a black woman who was very important to daily life in Harlem named Julia Jerome. Julia Jerome was the Black Ann Landers of her day. She was the romance advice columnist to whom black women wrote for help with their kids, but mostly with their husbands and their boyfriends. Julia Jerome was Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, which was really only one of about half dozen of characters that Josephine Cogdell Schuyler assumed. So what I want to do is read a little bit from a chapter in the book on Josephine Cogdell Schuyler called The Fall of a Fair Confederate. And I take the title of this chapter from one of her own essays. She wrote about being a Southern woman who moved into black culture, and she used the term with great irony, the fall of a fair Confederate, because this is how her family would have seen it, as an absolute fall. She was raised to great Texas wealth. Here she is as a young Texas horsewoman on a huge ranch. Her family was the most wealthy family in that whole area of Texas, and her father was a charter member of the Klan, as were all of her brothers. So she was raised in an exceedingly racist household. So when she says the fall of a fair Confederate, she's referencing how her family would have seen her life choices. I begin the chapter with 3 epigraphs from Josephine Cogdell Schuyler's writing, but I'm just going to share one of them with you, and it's this. She wrote, "Most of America is crazy on the race question." I think that's a pretty good start. Let me just, you have a second to move around. I'm going to sip water. It almost did not happen. But late on a cloudy, unseasonably warm Friday in early January 1928, a petite, graceful, white Texas beauty named Josephine Cogdell slipped into the New York City Marriage License Bureau with her black lover, George Schuyler, Harlem's most biting satirist and a widely published journalist. A short, dark, elegant man with excellent manners, an arch wit, and a sardonic smile. They were exceptionally well-dressed, dignified, and mature, both in their early 30s, but they were being treated like children. Conducted from one corner of the municipal building to another by scowling officials, then rushed through the steps of their civil ceremony without explanation or congratulation. A graying justice of the peace, anxious to clear his desk and get home, read from a perfunctory script without looking up. George barely had time to peck Josephine's cheek before they were hustled outside again, where they found themselves standing on the stone steps, left alone to adjust to their new status under the muted colors of a winter sunset slanting through lower Manhattan's administrative buildings. Josephine looked up from under her new green hat, swayed, and steadied herself with a gloved hand on George's arm. She had succumbed in a daze to the disappointing ceremony. Now, she imagined that she was being abducted by a dark prince who would take me to his castle in an exotic new land. The weight of racial intolerance was bearing down on her, demanding that she sacrifice, as she put it, everything I knew, and bid what she called an emotional farewell to the white world. She feared that she would never again return to what she knew or be known for who she was. It felt like dying. I have dropped completely out of sight. No one in the white world knows my whereabouts or will ever know. Josephine was admittedly dramatic. And she would have acknowledged being theatrical about having to cast my lot henceforth, as she put it, with the Negro. But for all of her hyperbole, she was not understating the vertigo-inducing stakes of marrying George that day. The taboo against interracial intimacy, or miscegenation as it was still then called, was fundamental to maintaining myths of racial difference and racial purity. In 1928, blacks and whites lived in such different worlds that white women who married black men did undergo a kind of social death, often expelled from family, home, and this kind of community in which she grew up. As these women attempted to enter a black world in which their presence was more often than not an unwelcome reminder of inequality and oppression, they found themselves without kin, church, or familiar social networks. Many crossed over without knowing much about black cultural expectations or black history. Some knew only a few black people. Most were ill-equipped to face the hostile reaction they engendered or to fit into the new world they had chosen. Josephine and George were newspaper buffs. To keep up with his competition, in fact, George sometimes read as many as a dozen papers a day. Josephine had been reading the black papers since the early 1920s when she had departed Texas for San Francisco. In fact, they had met through the Messenger, which he edited and to which she subscribed. She had also published some early poems in the Messenger. Both were keenly aware that they were making themselves outcasts. Their chief worry that day was keeping their marriage a secret from Josephine's family. "My family is incapable of ever understanding my marriage as anything but insane and disgraceful," Josephine believed. During the Depression, George and Josephine became Harlem's most vocal proponents of intermarriage, advocating interracial intimacy as the permanent solution, Josephine called it, to America's race problem. With Josephine's help, George became the most recognizable name in black journalism, a star. Their daughter, Philippa, and you see her there with them, born in 1931, conveniently enough, turned out to be a genius. And they proudly showed Philippa off as Exhibit A, proof of the benefits of miscegenation. Josephine had very set, and I have to say really entirely bizarre ideas about child rearing. And Philippa's musical talent, she was a piano prodigy. Her first concert at Carnegie Hall was before she was 10 years old. Philippa's talent was part of Josephine's launching pad for disseminating her odd ideas about child rearing. Prominent publications, including Lifetime, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, as well as black national journals like Ebony, the Pittsburgh Courier, and others, profiled the family. Josephine and George became known as the first interracial celebrity marriage in Harlem since the marriages of boxer Jack Johnson. And for the next 2 decades, the Schuylers straddled contradictions. They were a national news item, referred to often as America's strangest family. Amazingly enough, however, given the mainstream coverage, they were also a secret from the Texas Cogdells. Every Christmas, Josephine's father, D.C. Cogdell, sent his daughter in New York a big box of pecans harvested from the family trees. Believe me, not by him. He just sent them, but somebody else on the property did all that work of harvesting them. D.C. Cogdell never imagined that in their apartment in Harlem's Tony Sugar Hill, a black son-in-law would eat the nuts while reading Opportunity and writing about the absurdities of what he loved to call the pork skins. That's white people. While a mulatta granddaughter, as she would then have been known, in her room down the hall ate the pecans while practicing her piano. Josephine's sisters came to see Josephine in New York. They even visited her Harlem apartment, yet they somehow remained unaware of both husband and daughter. Family mail was addressed either to Miss Josephine Cogdell or to one of Josephine's pen names, Habajaneth. And every year, Josephine went home to Texas alone. No one asked questions. George found the studied silence remarkable. He tested it by writing about it in Modern Quarterly, a well-known socialist journal with a mostly white and a national readership. "It is incredible," George remarked, "how long a mixed couple can be married, their marriage be well known throughout Afro-America, and yet be unknown in the white world. Nothing," he wrote, "more forcibly reveals the social chasm dividing the two races." In a world where blacks and whites led separate lives, whites could afford not to know what they could not accept. Women, like Josephine, could hide not only in plain sight, but under Klieg lights. In addition to straddling the nation's contradictions over privacy and publicity, the Schuylers embodied all of their era's contradictory ideas about race itself. They became Harlem's most strident anti-essentialists, arguing, and they meant this quite seriously, that the terms Negro and Caucasian, black and white should be outlawed as propaganda devices, and that race is what they called not just a superstition, but they actually coined the word, which everyone corrected as a typo, superstitution. And what they meant by that was it was both a superstition and an institution. And they coined the term superstitution. My editors, they kept trying to fix that. No, I'd say that's right, superstitution. Yet they also constructed a marriage based on the erotic appeal of the very difference they decried. Sometimes they advocated all manner of passing and race crossing, believing that none of us have our own people distinct from others. At other times, they talked about we or us in ways that were inescapably racialized. Throughout their lives, the two principles of Harlem's interracial celebrity marriage oscillated among all of the available positions on the race debates of their day, and I think these are questions that remain central in our own debates. Is race blindness a goal or another form of racism? Can one attack racial essentialism but still celebrate race difference? What, if anything, do we owe our own race? Can we switch races, opting for an identity based on affiliation rather than blood? Sometimes the oscillation between these positions brought them closer together. Sometimes it drove a wedge between them. And in that, too, they mirrored the texture of political and emotional ties in Harlem. Carl Van Vechten, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the Schuylers' best friends and a walking set of contradictions all by himself. He paid a very telling tribute to his friend Josephine. Carl Van Vechten was not only Harlem's most famous honorary Negro, he was Harlem's most remarkable and New York's most remarkable pack rat. A man who knew absolutely everybody and corresponded with absolutely everybody. He was also a man who never threw away a scrap of paper. And he loved letters. He wrote thousands of them, and absolutely everybody, white and black, wrote to him. He saved those letters to the horror of his poor wife, Fania, who had to move stacks of them just to sit down anywhere in their vast Central Park West apartment. It drove her insane. But when it came time for Van Vechten, after decades of collecting, to turn that vast archive of letters over to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University as the core of the collection he created and named for his friend James Weldon Johnson, still the finest archival collection of black culture in the world, Van Vechten faced a very difficult decision. Should he retain or discard the filing system that he had used at home and that had been so precious to him? Not only was he an obsessive pack rat, he was a meticulous filer. And for all of those decades, every letter he received and every letter he filed, which meant every letter he ever received, was meticulously categorized under one of two categories. Either A, letters from whites, or B, letters from blacks. And this system has proved so accurate over the years that it is a secret resource for a handful of scholars in African American culture who happen to know that the librarians at the Beinecke Library, while the collection isn't categorized that way anymore, that they retained the inventory. And for those of us who do the work of archaeological recovery, of trying to bring back lost writers and unknown writers into the canon and into a wider readership, sometimes we write on somebody and we don't know their race. Was this person black or white? And we know we can go to Carl van Vechten's system because he never got it wrong. But there is only one exception in this vast and decades-long racial schema. All of Josephine Cogdell Schuyler's letters he placed under B, letters from blacks. Why? Now, in part, it was an inside joke between fellow race crossers. He knew about this background, and he knew that there she is on her porch, sitting on the lap of the family cook. He knew how far she'd had to come to leave that background in Texas with her racist family and become a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but he also knew it was something she could never completely leave behind, and that she carried that with her. Here she is on her Harlem roof reading. So saying letters from blacks about her to someone who grew up that way, right, was in part an inside joke between fellow race crossers. And it was in just the same playful spirit that Josephine sometimes referred to them all, Carl, Fania, his wife, George and herself, all of them white except for George, as us darkies. She would refer to them as us darkies a lot. But Van Vechten's sly miscategorization of Josephine was also an homage to her effort. He put his friend where she did her best to fit in, detractors and naysayers be damned. This tribute recognized that once she had married George and given birth to Philippa, she did not belong anywhere, and she ceased in an important sense to be white. Now, as a married bisexual and honorary Negro hated by many white people, Van Vechten had a keen sense of the costs and the joys of not fitting in. As he knew well, freedom from constraints is a taxing kind of freedom. It is different from the freedom that comes from privilege and standing. Freedom, too, to represent oneself, to express oneself, to pursue happiness, and so on. All the freedoms that we pursue from within our socially recognized identities, rather than by escaping those. We do not have to look far, Van Vechten was keenly aware, to find unhappy stories of those who free themselves from social categories only to find that they have nowhere to go. On January 6, 1928, as she stood on the steps of the municipal building, all of those challenges and questions were still in her future. Josephine's objective, that darkening Friday winter afternoon, was simpler. She was trying not to faint. Sometimes Miss Anne, as I mentioned at the very beginning, was asked what she was doing. You're going to have to do that twice because I'm not quite done. I have found, since I have become known in radical Negro work, Mary White Ovington wrote, she was the white founder of the NAACP. That is a factoid you can take away. I have found, since I have become known in radical Negro work, that colored people, under their pleasant greetings, are thinking, why did you take up the Negro cause? I try to answer, Mary White Ovington wrote, but it takes a long time to explain. Taking that time is the work of Miss Anne and Harlem, the white women of the Black Renaissance, and I would now be happy to take questions.
Okay, questions, anybody? Okay, oh, one last reminder, fill out your slips. We're going to be drawing a name at the end of the Q&A.
Free stuff, fill them out.
Free tickets.
I wish I could do it.
Andy,
I'm buying you some time to think about your questions and formulate them. I think that you're going to call on people, right? So
Yes, we're going to call.
Pick my
First
friends.
question here in the back. So I'm just a little confused as to who used the term Miss Anne.
It's a very good place to start. The term Miss Anne was used by black people behind the backs of white people. It was not something black people would say to the faces of white women. And part of what that history reflects is not just divided worlds, but ways of talking about one another behind our backs to which we are not always privy. One of the things that proved most difficult to research in this book was that I realized at a certain point I had a lot of information about what white mainstream culture had to say about black women who put Harlem at the center of their lives. And white mainstream culture said, you're a lunatic, you're crazy, and you can't come home, and sometimes we're going to kill you. Okay, a lot of these women had decades of death threats. I know what black men had to say about them because they put it in print. But I realized at a certain point I had almost nothing from black women about what they thought about Miss Anne, what they said about her behind her back. And I actually stopped the book for 8 months and just went back into the archives to see if I could find that. And one of the things I found was that in the same way blacks would not use the phrase Miss Anne to someone's face, you have to really make somebody angry to have that happen to their face. They were very cautious, Langston Hughes always said about blacks, we are a polite people, which you can read as historical necessity. One of the ways in which you could find the phrase referenced quite a bit is in cartoons from the era, where you see cartoons of Miss Anne called Miss Anne. There's also an enormous amount of Miss Anne characters as minor characters in black literature of the day, and they are called Anne. There's a famous Anne Carraway in one of Langston Hughes' short stories, and he goes on at great length about how she doesn't get it. She loved black people. She wanted black people to love her. They didn't seem to love her. Anne was confused. So you see the term Anne in the minor literature and in the poems. It was certainly used verbally, but it's not something that would have been said to people's faces.
Next question up here in the front.
Are you the first to look at these women from the perspective that you've taken?
Oh, I'm the first to look at them at all. Perspective or no, which is to say that this was really the missing piece of the story of the Harlem Renaissance. And in a way, these women are partly culpable for that historical gap and that black hole. There were really two generations of white women who became profoundly influential in black culture during the Harlem Renaissance. An older generation of women like Annie Nathan Meyer and Mary White Ovington, and a younger generation of women, sometimes new women and flappers, like Nancy Cunard and Josephine Cogdell Schuyler. The older generation of women, like Mary White Ovington and Annie Nathan Meyer, keenly aware of the very bad role most white women had played in the long history of interracial relations in this country, felt that the only way they could contribute meaningfully to black civil rights was by drawing no attention to themselves. And they went so far as to erase as much as they could all record of their activity and to not leave an archive and to not write about their accomplishments. So on the one hand, you have an older generation of very, very politically savvy, conscious white women saying, for me to do good here, I have to not make it about me. And they often went behind themselves with a broom, erasing their own footsteps. Then you have a second set of people erasing footsteps, just to say the families of many of these white women, particularly those who married black men or had black lovers, who tried to, if they had any access to it, destroy their diaries, destroy their letters, destroy record of their lives, and in some cases keep me from writing about them. So there has been a long history of erasure and self-erasure of these women. It's not surprising, as you see from my presentation tonight. I mean, let me put this really simply. Miss Anne was a mess. Right? She was all over the place in terms of what she represented. Her motives, they were wonderful, they were appropriative, and so it's been very hard to tell this story. There have been biographies of some of these women, but they tend to dismiss their time in Harlem in a few pages, although for many it was the most important time in their lives. And nobody had ever put them together as a group and said, wait a minute, where's the history of the white women of Black Harlem? And I also think that's about timing. It would have been a very bad mistake to tell this story until we had filled in more of the Black pieces first. So, in fact, first I did a book on Zora Neale Hurston. Then I felt maybe I could tell Miss Anne's story. But no, there has been no other story of Miss Anne prior to this. Thank you for letting me toot my own horn on that one.
Hello.
Hi.
Did you find subsequent to the 20s and 30s that the term evolved, that it came to mean something else in the Black community? And then, when did it all but disappear in the Black community?
The term Miss Anne never disappeared, still gets used. And my sense, not a lot, but it still has currency in the Black community. And my sense is that it never profoundly changed its meaning. It's always been a negative term. It's always been a way of referencing particularly that long history of white female employers who treated their domestic workers with disrespect and disregard. I have had mixed responses, particularly from the Black community, about my use of the phrase in the title because I'm a white woman using it. And so what does it mean for me to be using the phrase Miss Anne? Am I signaling a kind of insider hipness? Or, in fact, Arnold Rampersad, who many of you know is the biographer of both Ralph Ellison and Langston Hughes, in a recent review, I kind of love this, said it was a very cheeky thing for me to do. Now, there are worse things in life, right, than being called cheeky by Arnold Rampersad. I will take it. But people have raised issues because it is still a phrase in the Black community.
One more question here in the back.
I'm curious that you haven't mentioned as yet any of the Jewish women who were in Harlem during that period.
So the two that I focus on in this book, so in the very beginning of the talk, one of the things I mentioned was that when they came to Harlem, it was with a different relationship to whiteness than the other white women in this book because they were not yet white. They were not considered white at that moment in American history. Jews were not white. And for them, being who they were in Harlem, they suddenly became white. For Annie Nathan Meyer, who was one of the women I write about in this book and was a Jewish woman for whom anti-Semitism was a lifelong source of anguish, she wrote about in literally thousands of letters to the editor. Some of you may be familiar with some of those. For Annie Nathan Meyer, becoming white in Black Harlem was not only ancillary, it was fairly unwelcome. She wasn't interested in becoming white. But for Fannie Hurst, it was a huge prize. Fannie Hurst, I think, was someone who, rather than contribute to Harlem in a very meaningful way, is an example of somebody who just took from the culture largely for her own purposes. And one of her purposes was to feel more central, more mainstream, more at the heart of mainstream American society, to feel whiter. She was always someone who renounced and ignored her own Judaism. She said of herself as a child, if I could have denied being a Jew, I would have done it immediately. I wished my parents would stop talking about it. She was someone who, at the moment she wrote the only novel that had to do with race, and the novel for which she became most famous, and you all know it's Imitation of Life, it's still far and away her most famous work, she was really frustrated because she had become the single most successful, commercially speaking, writer of her day. She was the Stephen King of her day in dollars, but the critics did not like her. She wanted to be taken more seriously as a Jewish writer, as a woman writer. She didn't like being dismissed as a local color writer. She thought it smacked of anti-Semitism. She didn't want to be seen as a Jewish writer. She wanted to be seen as a mainstream writer. And she thought if she wrote about race, she'd win over the critics. So this is a very big piece of this story, and the history of Black-Jewish relations in Harlem is also a very big piece of this story. One of the women I had very much hoped to be able to write about was Amy Spingarn. And in fact, and some of you may be familiar with her brothers and her husband, who have come down to us as some of the most famous white male philanthropists of Harlem. Well, the money was Amy's for almost all of it. She destroyed her, there's no archive, there's no record, there are no diaries, there is no letter, there's nothing. So I tell her story as much as I can, but she was one of that generation who felt, I don't want to be at the center of this story, which is terribly unfortunate.
I'd like to add a different Jewish perspective to it. My mother was a Holocaust survivor and an Orthodox Jew, and was a member. And I grew up in an integrated Black Jewish environment. In the same house, I was raised in a rooming house with Black families from the South. My mother was in the Black community, and when she was 55 years old, she started the Black Jazz nightclub.
Wow.
That was Mom.
Wow.
And
what
with
year
her,
was that, if I could ask?
I'm from the Catskills. I'm from the Borscht Belt. And she even named the club after herself. Her name was Natalie, but all the Black people couldn't say Natalie, so they said Nellie. So it was called Club Nellie.
And when was that, if
This
you
was
don't
in
mind?
the 60s.
In the 60s.
And my mother, who didn't have a racist bone in her body because she had come out of the camps of Europe and didn't have that intrinsic American racism built in, didn't understand it, would go to shul on Saturday and gospel church on Sunday.
So
And then take her Black lover blatantly, without any shame whatsoever, and she would go down to Harlem to pick out the acts for the nightclub. Right? So it's a slightly different perspective. It's a different class perspective. But the fact is that there was a Black Jewish integrated community in the 60s before the Civil Rights Movement that existed that is rarely ever talked about.
Well, there have been some wonderful books on that community of the 60s, and there needs to be more work done going even earlier to this period of the 20s and 30s. And the reason I went back to this slide is because I want to agree as vehemently as I can that there's an enormous difference between coming from this background, right? Which, I mean, this looks like a postcard prebellum, doesn't it? I mean, this looks like, you know, something from the plantation, from the big house, right? And coming particularly from working class Jewish backgrounds, there is no coincidence to the fact that the vast majority of white scholars in Black studies, and that is itself a phenomenon of importance that goes back to this period, are Jews. Because there is a point of not just identification, but indeed of shared struggle. And there is a big difference in different kinds of whiteness, different kinds of class background. One of the reasons I think Miss Anne is, if I could just say this in answer to your question, that Miss Anne is important to look at, and that it was important to fill in her story and not just let it fade away, never told, is that one of the things her story exposes is that whiteness and Blackness not only were constructed socially, and not only were constructed very differently socially, but that they were never monolithic, and that there were all kinds of whiteness and all kinds of Blackness being constructed at the moment, and Jewish whiteness, if you can even use that phrase in the 1920s, it's quite contested whether you can even say that, was of course different. And so there's lots of reasons that we see a long, long history of Black-Jewish relations, which from which this book benefited enormously. There's great scholarship on that.
Next question up here.
I was going to ask, was this more of a northern thing? Because I lived in the South for years. I never ran across that. I also lived in Louisiana where there were a lot of Blacks that could pass, especially up the Cane River. I mean, it was just the way it was, and it's been written by one of the Blacks that came from the Cane River. But I never heard that kind of reference that you're talking about.
The kind of Miss Anne reference?
Yeah. I mean, I knew a lot of course, it changed when I got there in '84 to when I left. I mean, you would see integration, you would see mixed couples. It's in Louisiana when I lived, you saw a lot in New Orleans. And I don't know I wondered what it was like in the 20s there, if it was like Harlem, because there were a lot of mix there.
I know much more about the North and Harlem than I do the South, so I'm not going to pretend expertise on your important question. But I am going to say that whenever I think about, as a white scholar, that, I never heard that. For me, the silence becomes part of what I want to study, because I don't know if that means nobody feels they can say that to me, or that wasn't being said. And my first assumption is usually, that's not being said to me, but it might be being said. So I just don't know. In terms of the community you grew up in, it may have been a very ideal community in which these things were not being expressed, but that would then be something outside the American mainstream. Because, the history of race in America is a really bad, unhappy history, and it is entirely unrealistic for white people to expect black people not to talk about that, right, all the time. So I don't know, but in the, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. Part of what we learn is how much things change and also how much things don't. Yeah?
Our next question here in the back.
I don't know how to. You're not the first woman I've heard about white women going up to Harlem during the Renaissance. I was raised by a black woman from Baton Rouge who spent many years in during the Harlem Renaissance in Harlem. And she didn't have a lot of kind words to say about the white women that came up to Harlem. She felt it was purely, and I'll sanitize it, sexual adventurism. Mm-hmm. She was pretty resentful. Mm-hmm. And so my question, I have two questions. My first question is, how accurate do you think Marie was, Marie being this woman, if accurate at all? And my second question is, I remember in her room, she had dozens and dozens of jazz records on the Au Fait label.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell me why that label was chosen?
Well, it's tongue-in-cheek, right? It's,
yeah.
We can do this. Now, let me tell you something that I'm not 100% sure of, because I actually don't know the facts on this one. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Au Fait label saying, look, we can turn the tables and we can be derisive as a group about white people, which is, of course, what white people have been doing to blacks for centuries, right? I wouldn't be surprised if the Au Fait label was at least partly white-owned, because that's part of the ecology of race at this moment, is that one of the ways in which you become part of an others community is by being even angrier at the community you came from than they are. So Josephine, for example, always picked up the phrase pork-skinned. Some of the women I write about, their references to white women are much more scathing than any black writers would be. In fact, I'm getting to your question, I promise. But one of the women I write about in this book is a woman who has always been assumed to be black. She's in every anthology of African-American women's writing. Her name is Lillian Wood. And she wasn't a major writer, but she's always been understood to be a black writer, because in her novel, she depicts white women as absolute monsters for their complicity with the long history of the lynching of black men under the so-called, myth of the black rapist. And everyone just took for granted that only someone of color would look at, but in fact, this was a gesture. So the Au Fait label, there could be very multi-layered of what's going on there. How accurate was Marie? Marie's feelings are, of course, completely accurate as feelings, and I wish I could have interviewed her. Was it, in fact, factually, historically the case that all of the white women who went up to Harlem were going for sexual adventures? It's a little more complicated than that, which doesn't change what Marie, right? What Marie was saying. As the Black Vogue, what Langston Hughes called the Vogue for Black Harlem, was a sexualized Vogue. So we're talking about a moment in American history when prevalent throughout the culture is primitivism. Some of you are familiar with this idea, this notion that the primitivists believed in deeply, that white culture was washed out, arid, sterile, lacking in some kind of vital life force, that the only way to revitalize and infuse white culture was through the so-called primitive other. And some painters looked to Tahiti, and some writers looked to the American Southwest, and a lot of people looked to Africa. And if they couldn't get to Africa, they said, well, we'll go to Harlem. And no, this is a real thing. Now, you have to add to this the way race is understood at this moment in history, which it's hard in a way for us to wrap our minds around this. But at this moment in history, blackness is understood as a pollutant and a contagion. This goes back to the myth of the one-drop rule. And the way in which this pollutant and contagion is understood across the gender line is entirely opposite. White men are encouraged to go take medicinal doses of blackness to fortify themselves. And there is a belief that blackness is like a drop, and white men can fortify their vital juices with it, and they will be better for it. Whereas white women, right, are warned if they overexpose themselves to drops of blackness, drops, right, that they will lose their whiteness and darken. So this is a period in which the very notion of race itself is sexualized. So much so, and then I'll stop with this one question, but so much so that if I can just share one really wild anecdote. Mary White Ovington, at her time in the Harlem Renaissance, a very matronly woman by design, deliberately, hosted the most important political interracial gatherings of the day. These were dinners that were political salons for discussing current events. And the white press couldn't stand it, and they saw it as somehow prurient and sexual. But you couldn't sexualize Mary White Ovington. She had seen to that. You just couldn't do it. She was the most matronly woman. So you know what the white press said about her interracial dinners? That she was hosting all of them to procure black lovers for young white women. This is the extent to which race is always already sexualized in racist culture. It's part of how racism works. So was Marie right? Absolutely. Was it factually the case that all white women were going to Harlem for was sexual adventures? Absolutely not. But even Mary White Ovington, as sort of desexualized a political activist as I can imagine, was sexualized by the mainstream media. So does that answer it in a way? Anyway, long answer. Sorry about that.
Next question right here.
Yeah, I was thinking about the comment about Miss Anne.
Yes.
And I'm fortunate enough, I didn't have any aunts and uncles, but my great aunts and uncles were born from 1894 to 1919. And by the time I got interested in family, I was in my 40s, and they were in their 80s and 90s. In fact, 3 of them lived to be close to 100.
Wow.
And all the women, and we fail to remember, at this time in our country, most African Americans worked in the service industry.
Exactly.
And perfect example, my great uncle went to a dance in LA in 1917. And he was kind of what would be called kind of in the upper class black community. But at the social functions, you were announced by who you worked for. Like, this is Mr. and Mrs. Smith with the Wrigleys. Or this is Mr. and Mrs. James with the Armors.
Yes.
You know, so your status was pegged to who you worked for. But you could not have a grievance, in the service industry, you could not have a grievance with your employer. So they were always talked about away from the job, and the term Mrs. Ann was used. And even my great aunts and uncles, even in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, they would never speak their mind in front of someone white.
And would they have ever called a white woman Miss Ann to her face?
No.
It's not thinkable, right?
No, it's not thinkable.
Yeah.
But they were very cordial, very pleasant people in public.
Yes.
And it's kind of like almost like two personalities. And the women all kind of raised white children. They were in the service industry. The men were a little bit more fortunate. One worked for the post office, believe it or not, started in 1920 to 1940. And another one worked for Ford. But we didn't have very many jobs in industry. So you were tied to services and individuals. And you had to be on your best behavior at all times. And you could never display any anger or aggression. So when you got among your own, you use terms like that to describe people or to air your grievances.
And then when amongst your own, there might be a woman like Josephine present, right, living in the apartment building, going to all of the private dinners, going to the things where there were not other white tourists, it posed all of these complicated problems. Do we let her in on it? Do we not say anything because she's there? And so she was a real nuisance in her community. I don't just mean Josephine, I mean white women who said, I'm staying. They were a real nuisance because people couldn't talk freely. Yeah.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. You said that the white women who joined the Harlem community suffered more stigma than the men who did so. But
than the white men.
When the white men. But was it more of something that women did than men?
Oh, what a good question. Did everybody hear the question? Was the actual joining of the Harlem community something that more white women than white men did? There is a sense in which that is absolutely true, but it was not always by choice or design. The white men could go in and out of Harlem and go home again, uncontaminated, unpolluted, undarkened. But white women who went too far, and the line of going too far was really quite thin, often could not go home again. Now, I don't mean they couldn't get on the subway. Of course they could, but they were no longer welcomed by their families, by their communities. Some of them lost their jobs. And some of them moved permanently into Harlem life because, as women, they found that they were ostracized. This goes back to the question about sexualization. They were sexualized, ostracized, couldn't go home again. Right. Very few of them moved into Harlem because they could come and go. They could go from Greenwich to Harlem. They could go from Greenwich Village to Harlem. They could go from Rye, New York to Harlem and back again. And that was the trick, is that they could go back again so they didn't have to. Carl Van Vechten could keep his apartment in Central Park West. He could go back and forth. It just wasn't a problem. I'll tell you, there's a small population of white men who we know did move to Harlem and who are another untold story, and that is gay white men who did, because Harlem was seen as a pleasure ground not just for interracial sexuality, but Harlem was seen as a pleasure ground as well for any form of taboo sexuality or taboo behavior, including gay sexuality. And so there were some gay white men who went to Harlem to be free to do what they dared not do openly elsewhere, and stayed. Some of them may have passed for black, and that's why it's hard to get their story.
Okay, we're going to have one last question, but before we do, Teddy Baggins.
Oh!
Teddy. Oh, Teddy, you won. Okay,
Woo-hoo!
So see me right afterwards. I have some tickets for you. Okay, yay, Teddy. Okay.
She's my cousin.
Oh.
I'm glad she
won. It
won.
wasn't rigged, I promise.
It was rigged.
This may be carrying on too much with the Miss Sam, but I just thought, I had to laugh when I saw the title and saw this was on the program. My mother called my younger sister, who was very Camille-like, I'll say, Miss Ann,
Really?
as did her roommate in college later. So it wasn't just that it was referring to Miss Ann as the help, but it was this idea somehow that Miss Ann wasn't doing much of anything.
Yes, which was, of course, the way the black community sort of dismissed these employers as a category. That's wonderful. Can I just say, in response to that question, and then I'm really going to stop, I promise, that one of the things I'm doing on my website is creating a place called the Miss Ann Archive. So those of you who have stories that you think are worth telling, because these are stories about racial history that maybe they matter, if you write to me, if you want them on the archive, we will put them on the Miss Ann Archive, and we will continue to expand this missing piece of history. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Carla.